When my landlady said the shower was broken, I didn't expect our accidental closeness to turn into something unforgettable. The first time I saw her, I wasn't sure whether to feel intimidated or curious. Moving into a new apartment is usually a mundane chore, but this one felt different the moment I stepped into the slightly creaking hallway. The scent of lavender and old wood wrapped around me like an unexpected welcome. She appeared from the doorway to her office, a graceful woman in her early 40s, her posture relaxed but self-assured, as though she carried her entire life's confidence in the way she leaned against the doorframe. "Welcome," she said, her voice warm but measured, with a faint smile that hinted at something unspoken. Her eyes met mine briefly, and for a second I caught a spark of quiet curiosity, as though she was assessing me in a way more thorough than mere landlord responsibilities required. I handed over my identification and signed the lease, but it felt less like a transaction and more like the beginning of an unwritten conversation. As she handed me the keys, our hands brushed. It was nothing extraordinary, yet I felt the subtle electricity in the contact, the warmth of her fingers lingering just a fraction longer than necessary. I looked up to meet her gaze again and noticed a faint crease of amusement at the corner of her eyes. A nervous chuckle escaped me, which seemed to relax her further. The tension was delicate, a quiet acknowledgement of the unspoken curiosity between us. She gave me a quick tour of the apartment, her movements effortless and confident, guiding me past creaky floorboards and sunlit windows that overlooked the quiet street. I noticed small details, how her hair fell gently over her shoulder as she leaned to point out the bathroom, the faint perfume that seemed to mingle with the air of the apartment, the rhythm of her breathing as she spoke, calm yet measured. Even in those early moments, there was a sense of layered complexity in her presence. She wasn't someone to be easily understood, and I found myself intrigued, not in a superficial way, but because her quiet composure and subtle warmth suggested depth, experience, and a touch of vulnerability beneath the surface. By the time I was unpacking the last box, I realized that something about this apartment, and this landlady, had already left an impression. I wasn't just renting a space, I was stepping into a rhythm I hadn't anticipated, one that promised quiet encounters, unexpected moments, and a slow-building tension that neither of us would yet acknowledge. The air between us was soft and tentative, yet charged with the faint hum of curiosity and possibilities that only time could reveal. I hadn't expected the first week in the apartment to come with surprises, but the broken shower was the kind of mundane problem that immediately felt personal. I stepped into the tiny bathroom, flicking the light switch, and saw the faucet dripping slowly, rhythmically, almost like a metronome marking time I wasn't ready to face. I muttered under my breath, already imagining how inconvenient this would be, when I heard the soft knock of the door. "It's broken," she said, leaning against the doorframe with a casual grace that somehow made a leaky faucet feel like a scandalous confession. Her hair caught the morning light streaming through the small window, and the faint scent of her perfume mingled with the clean, slightly chemical smell of the bathroom. "Guess we'll have to make do," she added, her voice teasing but careful, like she was testing the waters. Without thinking, I smiled and replied, "I guess we'll have to share." The words hung between us, ridiculous and playful, yet somehow weighted. She paused, a slight flicker of surprise crossing her expression, followed by a quiet laugh. It wasn't mockery, not exactly, it was the kind of laugh that carries both amusement and curiosity, a subtle acknowledgement of the tension crackling in the tiny space. We stood there for a moment, caught in the stillness. The room suddenly felt smaller, warmer, the proximity unavoidable. Our shoulders brushed lightly as she pointed toward the faucet, and I noticed the faint heat radiating from her arm. I could see the subtle shift in her posture, the way her head tilted slightly, as though she were considering whether to retreat or stay. I stayed still, aware that every movement mattered more than it should. Her laugh faded into a quiet smile, and she shook her head. "You're impossible," she murmured, but her eyes lingered on mine a fraction longer than necessary. Even in that simple, seemingly trivial moment, there was a tension that neither of us could, or wanted to, ignore. The dripping faucet became secondary, what mattered was the delicate dance of glances, gestures, and the unspoken awareness of each other's presence. When she finally stepped back and left the room, I felt an unexpected pull, a curiosity that had nothing to do with plumbing. I realized then that this apartment, and this landlady, was going to be more complicated than I anticipated. And somewhere in that realization, I felt the first undeniable spark of intrigue, the quiet tension that would thread through every shared space and accidental touch in the days to come. Life in the apartment settled into a rhythm, but with it came moments that neither of us could ignore. It wasn't deliberate, most of these encounters felt accidental, ordinary on the surface, but the effect was cumulative, subtle, and charged. Narrow hallways, tight staircases, and shared chores suddenly became stages for fleeting touches and lingering glances. One evening, I was hauling groceries up the creaky stairs when she appeared at the top landing, balancing a stack of freshly laundered towels. Our eyes met, and for a second, everything else, the weight of the bags, the dim hallway light, the muffled sounds from neighboring apartments, faded away. We collided lightly as I maneuvered past her in the hallway, her shoulder brushing mine. It was brief, almost inconsequential, but the warmth of her skin against mine lingered far longer than it should have, leaving a faint, unexpected charge in the air. Then there was the time she asked for help fixing a squeaky door hinge. We crouched side by side on the worn wooden floor, hands occasionally touching as we passed each other the screwdriver. Each contact was innocent enough in isolation, yet the repetition made my chest tighten and my mind notice things I shouldn't. The scent of her shampoo mingled with the faint metallic tang of the hinge, and the quiet concentration in her eyes made the room feel impossibly intimate. Even ordinary tasks, the trash, the recycling, checking the mailbox, became opportunities for subtle closeness. I noticed how her hand lingered a fraction longer on the railing as she leaned down to pick up a misplaced letter, how her shoulder almost pressed against mine in passing. Every brush of skin, every accidental laugh shared in tight quarters, carried a tension that neither of us fully acknowledged aloud. And yet, there was comfort in it too. She moved with a grace that suggested experience and ease, and I found myself drawn to the small, human details, the tilt of her head when she laughed at something minor, the way her fingers brushed her hair behind her ear, the quiet steadiness of her presence in a space that suddenly felt more like home. By the end of that week, I realized our accidental encounters had woven an invisible thread between us. It wasn't about words or confessions yet, it was about the small, sensory moments that built intimacy, the warmth of her arm brushing mine, the rhythm of her steps alongside mine, the subtle awareness of each other's presence that made even the most mundane chore feel charged. Slowly, imperceptibly, the apartment stopped being just my new home, it had become a space where anticipation lingered in the air, quiet and persistent, waiting for something neither of us was ready to name. It started with the faint strains of music drifting from her apartment late one night. I had been unpacking in my own space when a soft, melancholy melody reached my ears, carrying a weight I hadn't expected. Something compelled me to knock on her door, and when she answered, the warm glow of her living room spilled into the hallway, illuminating her in a way that made her seem both approachable and untouchably distant. "Everything okay?" I asked, trying to sound casual, though my heart beat a little faster than necessary. She hesitated, then smiled softly. "Yes, just reminiscing, I suppose," she said, stepping aside to let me in. The room smelled faintly of sandalwood and old books, a comforting mixture that felt like stepping into another world. She gestured toward the couch, and I sat across from her, careful not to invade the small, intimate space she seemed to have carefully curated. We talked for hours. At first, it was small things, the quirks of the building, favorite songs, books we'd read. But gradually, the conversation deepened, peeling back layers neither of us had expected to share with a new acquaintance, or, in my case, a landlady. She spoke about a recent loss in her family, her voice soft but steady, revealing a vulnerability that contrasted with her usual composure. I found myself listening with full attention, aware of the subtle rise and fall of her chest, the way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, the gentle warmth of her hands as she clasped them in her lap. At one point, our knees brushed lightly as we shifted on the couch. It was almost imperceptible, yet I felt the weight of it, the unspoken acknowledgement of proximity and shared space. I realized how attuned I had become to these small gestures, the tilt of her head when she was thoughtful, the quiet intakes of breath, the way her eyes lingered on mine longer than necessary. When the clock finally reminded us that hours had passed, neither of us moved immediately. There was a pause, a silence thick with meaning, as though the room itself was holding its breath. Her hand hovered near mine, and I hesitated, feeling the pull of connection and the delicate tension that had been building since the first day I arrived. She finally withdrew her hand with a soft laugh, but the intimacy of that moment stayed with me long after I left. That night, I realized that this apartment, her presence, the quiet warmth in her voice, the soft comfort of her shared vulnerabilities, had begun to feel like something more than a place to live. It was a space where emotional walls could soften, where laughter and unspoken understanding could exist side by side, and where the tension between us deepened in a way that was subtle, patient, and utterly intoxicating. It was a night that began like any other, but small, unexpected circumstances transformed it into something neither of us would forget. A sudden power outage plunged the apartment into darkness, leaving only the dim glow of candlelight flickering against the walls. I heard her soft footsteps approaching before I saw her, the quiet rhythm of her movement both familiar and electrifying. She appeared in the doorway of the kitchen, holding a small cluster of candles. Her silhouette was framed by the gentle light, casting soft shadows across her features. I felt a pull in my chest, an awareness of how close we were in the confined space. She smiled at me, a quiet, knowing smile, and I realized we were both conscious of the subtle tension in the air. We moved through the apartment together, lighting candles and laughing quietly at the absurdity of fumbling in the dark. The atmosphere was intimate not just because of the light, but because of the shared vulnerability, the temporary disruption of our routines creating a space where closeness was inevitable. Every brush of her hand as she passed me the matches sent a shiver up my spine. I noticed the faint warmth of her skin, the soft scent of her perfume mixing with the waxy aroma of the candles, and the way her eyes caught the flame as she looked up at me. When the last candle was lit, we found ourselves sitting on the couch, close enough that our knees touched. The contact was accidental, or so we both claimed, but it carried a weight neither of us could deny. Her shoulder brushed against mine as we adjusted to the shadows, and the warmth radiating from her made the dimly lit room feel impossibly intimate. We didn't speak at first, just letting the quiet settle around us, the soft hum of the city outside, the flickering light painting patterns across the walls, the slow rhythm of our breathing. At one point, her head tilted slightly, brushing against my shoulder as she leaned back. The contact was gentle, unforced, and yet it sent a flutter through me that I couldn't ignore. We shared small, unspoken gestures, the occasional touch of a hand, the soft laughter over minor mishaps, the way our glances met and lingered longer than necessary. It wasn't about words or declarations, it was about presence, awareness, and the intimacy of shared, quiet moments. By the end of the evening, I realized how these little accidents, the power outage, the close quarters, the shared laughter, had brought us closer in ways that neither of us could articulate. The apartment, the flickering candlelight, and the soft press of her shoulder against mine had created a delicate tension, a sense of intimacy that was both comforting and electrifying. In that stillness, I understood that our connection was deepening, slow and unhurried, yet undeniable, a quiet, patient pull that neither of us could resist. The weekend was approaching, and I had decided to take a short trip out of the city. Packing my bag felt unusually heavy, not because of the clothes or toiletries, but because of the thought of leaving her apartment, and her, behind, even briefly. I didn't anticipate the quiet storm of emotions that would unfold in those final moments before I stepped out the door. She met me in the hallway, holding her coat loosely in one hand, her other hand brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. The evening light from the window caught her face, highlighting the subtle lines of experience around her eyes, and for a moment, I was struck by the quiet beauty of someone who carried both confidence and vulnerability in equal measure. "I'll miss having you around," she said, her voice softer than usual, almost hesitant. There was a weight behind the words that made my chest tighten. I paused, unsure how to respond. I'll miss being here too," I admitted, my own voice betraying a nervousness I hadn't felt in years. Our hands met briefly as I adjusted my bag strap, the touch accidental yet lingering. Her fingers brushed mine, and I felt the warmth of her skin seep into mine, leaving a trail of electricity I couldn't ignore. We stood in that quiet hallway, the world outside fading, as though the city had ceased to exist for a single heartbeat. She looked down for a moment, then back at me, eyes searching mine with a vulnerability that made me aware of every subtle gesture, her hands fidgeting with the coat, the slight tremor in her shoulders, the faint sigh that escaped her lips. I didn't realize how much I'd gotten used to this, she admitted, and the quiet confession hit harder than any dramatic declaration could have. I wanted to reach for her hand again, to bridge the distance that lingered between us, but hesitation held me back. The age gap, the landlord-tenant dynamic, the social perceptions, they all pressed quietly against the edges of the moment. And yet, beneath it all, there was an undeniable pull, a magnetic tension that neither of us could, or wanted to, ignore. For a long minute, we stood there, close but unspoken, aware of the delicate line between friendship and something more. Finally, she let her hand fall away with a soft laugh that carried a hint of nervousness, a gentle acknowledgement that while we weren't ready to name it, the feelings were real. I stepped toward the door with a mixture of anticipation and restraint, knowing that when I returned, everything between us could change. In that hallway, with the evening light catching the edges of her face and our brief, lingering touches, I realized that our story was no longer about accidental proximity or fleeting gestures. It had become something more fragile, more urgent, and infinitely more intoxicating, an emotional tension waiting to be explored, confessed, and, eventually, embraced. The weekend passed in a haze of anticipation, and when I returned, the apartment felt different, as if the air itself had shifted, holding the unspoken tension from our last encounter. She greeted me with that same quiet warmth, her eyes lighting up in a way that made the small space feel suddenly expansive. There was a softness in her movements, a gentle ease that suggested she had been thinking about me during my absence. We spent the evening together on the balcony, the city bathed in the amber glow of the setting sun. The warmth of the fading light kissed her skin, highlighting the subtle lines of experience that made her both elegant and approachable. I noticed how her fingers absent-mindedly traced the rim of her mug, how her hair caught the breeze and brushed against her cheek. Each small detail was magnified by the intimacy of the moment, the quiet closeness of shared space. I reached out instinctively, my fingers brushing hers as we adjusted our positions on the bench. She didn't pull away, instead, her hand lingered, the warmth of her skin seeping into mine. It was a deliberate touch, unspoken yet full of meaning, and I felt the gentle steadying of her heartbeat through that simple contact. For the first time, the distance between us, both physical and emotional, seemed to dissolve, leaving only the quiet acknowledgement of mutual desire and trust. We spoke softly, sharing stories of our day, small confessions, and laughter that felt like it belonged entirely to the two of us. Every glance, every subtle smile, carried the weight of emotions that had been building slowly, patiently, over weeks of accidental touches and late-night conversations. Her head tilted slightly, brushing against my shoulder, and I felt the warmth radiate, a physical echo of the closeness we had been cultivating in silence. As darkness settled over the city, I realized that our connection had reached a new depth. It wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic confessions, it was about presence, attentiveness, and the comfort of knowing that someone sees you, truly and completely, even in your quietest moments. The hand I held, the brush of her cheek against mine, the steady warmth of her body beside me, these were the threads weaving a bond that was patient, respectful, and profoundly intimate. In that evening light, on that quiet balcony, I understood that our story had found its resolution. The tension that had been simmering between us had not dissipated, it had transformed into a steady, warm connection that promised trust, affection, and a future of quiet, shared moments. And as I held her hand, feeling her heartbeat synchronize with mine, I knew that this was only the beginning of a deeper, enduring intimacy, a slow-burn romance that was as gentle as it was undeniable. If you enjoyed this slow-burn story, don't forget to hit like and subscribe for more age-gap romance tales filled with subtle tension, heartfelt moments, and quiet intimacy. Share your thoughts in the comments. Who was your favorite character, and what moment made your heart skip a beat?